World Trade Organization and the environment. Globalization has been initiated in the form of setting up of World Trade Organization, that is WTO. In general, globalization refers to the establishment of a common international business environment. WTO is an international organization whose primary purpose is to open trade for the benefit of all. The WTO principles of non-discrimination and level playing field seek to ensure that all countries across the world have an equal opportunity to trade as well as invest in any other country of the world on equal terms. The removal of tariff and non-tariff barriers and the establishment of certain agreements, mainly TRIPS and TRIMS, largely facilitate this level playing field. The expectation therefore is that with the advent of WTO, a new era had begun whereby there would be a narrowing down of the divergence between the developed and the developing countries along with higher growth of the GDP. The implications for the environment, however, are a derivative of the broader growth pattern. The environmentalists thus fear that talks about free trade would be used as an excuse to give excessive weight to maximization of GDP and subvert the environmental goals. Free traders, on the other hand, fear that talks about environmental protection would be used as an excuse by some sectors to secure protection against competition from abroad. The debate raises some key questions. Does trade liberalization limit the choice of environmental policies? Can the WTO system with trade and its priority support the environment and health?
After studying this module, you shall be able to understand the WTO and what it stands for, identify the environmental provisions in the WTO agreements, evaluate the adequacy of WTO for the purpose of environmental protection, analyze the WTO environment dispute, appreciate the case for multilateral environmental agreements to protect the environment. WTO is an international organization whose primary purpose is to open trade for the benefit of all. The WTO principles of non-discrimination and level playing field seek to ensure that all countries across the world have an equal opportunity to trade as well as invest in any other country of the world on equal terms. The implications for the environment, however, are a derivative of the broader growth pattern. The environmentalists thus fear that the talks about free trade would be used as an excuse to give excessive weight to maximization of GDP and subvert the environmental goals. Free traders, on the other hand, fear that the talks about environmental protection would be used as an excuse by some sectors to secure protection against competition from abroad. The WTO is the only international organization dealing with the global rules of trade between nations. It aims at reducing obstacles to international trade and ensuring a level playing field for all, thus contributing to economic growth and development. It came into being in 1995 with the aim to ensure that trade flows as smoothly, predictably, and freely as possible. Its membership stood at 159 countries on 2nd March 2013. Its principles, namely MFN, that is most favored nation, treating all people equally, national treatment, treating foreigners and locals equal, and level playing field are fundamental to its functioning.
The WTO agreements cover goods, services, and intellectual property. It all began with the trade in goods from 1947 to 1994. The General Agreement on Trade and Tariffs, that is GATT, was the forum for negotiating lower custom duty rates and other trade barriers. But since 1995, the updated GATT has become WTO's umbrella agreement for trade in goods, manufactured goods or agricultural products. The same principle of free and fair trade, originally only applicable to trade in goods, were extended to services like banking, telecommunication, insurance, etc. under the General Agreement on Trade in Services, included in the Uruguay round of trade negotiations. Another agreement negotiated in the Uruguay round is TRIPS, that is trade related aspects of intellectual property rights. When trade is involved, it lays down rules for protection of intellectual property, that is copyrights, patents, trademarks, industrial designs, undisclosed information, etc. These rules enable the creators of intellectual property to prevent others from using their inventions, designs, or other creations and use that right to negotiate payment in return for other using them. These are called intellectual property rights. Here the greatest attention has been on pharmaceutical patents, where the WTO seeks protection of the investors' rights, but at the same time allows governments room to make treatments affordable. Further, there is an agreement on trade-related investment measures, that is TRIMS, which prohibits trade restrictive investment measures such as local content or trade balancing requirements that are inconsistent with the basic provisions of GATT 1994. This agreement is applicable only to measures that affect trade in goods. All WTO agreements are designed to forward its central pursuit of opening up national markets to intellectual trade with justifiable exceptions and adequate flexibilities. For the implementation and monitoring of these agreements, WTO has review councils and committees along with the dispute settlement mechanisms for resolving trade quarrels. The main aim is to encourage and contribute to sustainable development and raise people's welfare through market opening, accompanied by sound policies adhering to each member's needs and aspirations.
WTO agreements aim at reduction or elimination of barriers to trade, that is, import tariffs as well as non tariff barriers, and agreements on rules governing the conduct of international trade, for example, anti dumping, subsidies, product standards, etc. WTO agreements cover goods, services, and intellectual property. It started with GATT, which was Forum for Trade in Goods, Manufactured Goods, and or Agricultural Products. The General Agreement on Trade and Services GATS was an agreement for free and fair trade of services like banking, telecommunication, insurance, etc. Another agreement, TRIPS, that is trade related aspects of intellectual property rights, lay down rules for protection of intellectual property like copyrights, patents, trademarks, industrial designs, undisclosed information, etc., where trade is involved. The Marrakesh Agreement establishing the WTO includes among its objectives optimal use of the world's resources, sustainable development, and environmental protection. There are provisions in the agreement on agriculture, GATS, and TRIPS to name a few. But by far the most important provisions as far as environmental issues are concerned are Article 20 of the GATT and the agreements on sanitary and phytosanitary measures and technical barriers to trade.
Agreement on Sanitary and Phytosanitary Measures, that is SPS, Animal and Plant Health Hygiene. The SPS agreement was negotiated in the Uruguay round to set out the basic rules for food safety and animal and plant health standards. It allows member countries to set their own standards but also says that regulations must be based on science. They should be applied only to the extent necessary to protect human, animal, or plant health or life with no unjustifiable discrimination between countries where similar conditions prevail. to ensure that quantitative measures are not used as an excuse to secure protection for domestic producers rather than protect health and safety. The agreement encourages members to adopt international standards, guidelines, and recommendations where they exist. Country could apply higher standards if they were based on science and supported by a risk assessment process. They can also, to some extent, apply the precautionary principle, a kind of safety first approach to deal with the scientific uncertainty. This principle allows preventive measures to prevent harm to the environment in the absence of definite scientific evidence. Article 57 of the SPS agreement allows temporary precautionary measures.
Article 20 lays down the general exceptions to GATT provisions, of which clauses B and G are of paramount significance to the environment. These are: B. To protect human, animal, or plant life or health. G. Relating to the conservation of exhaustible natural resources if such measures are made effective in conjunction with restrictions on domestic production or consumption. Article 20 states that, subject to the requirement that such measures are not applied in a manner which would constitute a means of arbitrary or unjustifiable discrimination between countries where the same conditions prevail, or a disguised restriction on international trade, nothing in this agreement shall be construed to prevent the adoption or enforcement by any contracting party of measures. The SPS agreement was negotiated in the Uruguay round to set out the basic rules for food safety and animal and plant health standards. It allows countries to set their own standards, but also lays that regulations must be based on science. They should be applied only to the extent necessary to protect human, animal, or plant health or life, with no unjustifiable discrimination between countries where similar conditions prevail, and they must not be used as an excuse to secure protection for domestic producers.
Technical standards with restrictive trade effects are permitted for four legitimate objectives, including inter alia, national security requirements, prevention of deceptive practices, protection of human health or safety, protection of animal and plant life or health, or the environment, Article 2.2, provided the effect is not more restrictive than necessary, taking into account the risk the non fulfillment of the objective would create. In assessing that risk, the relevant elements of consideration are, inter alia, available scientific and technical information, technology or end use of the products. Members are also required to base their standards on those developed by international bodies which are presumed to be in compliance with the agreement. In other cases, and where measures have a significant impact on trade, parties are obliged to notify the measures to the WTO and render an opportunity to others to comment.
The agreement on technical barriers to trade was negotiated in the Uruguay round. It was an attempt to identify how to meet the needs to apply technical standards and at the same time avoid protectionism in disguise. It tries to ensure that regulations, standards, testing, and certification procedures do not create unnecessary obstacles to trade. It obliges members to ensure that national treatment and non discrimination apply when technical standards are adopted as mandatory regulations. Technical standards with restrictive trade effects are permitted for four legitimate objectives. They are national security requirements, prevention of deceptive practices, protection of human health or safety, and protection of animal and plant life or health or the environment. WTO members are also required to base their standards on those developed by international bodies which are presumed to be in compliance with the agreement. Other green provisions include intellectual property. Governments can refuse to issue patents that threaten human, animal, or plant life or health or risk serious damage to the environment. TRIPS Article 27. Subsidies and countervail. Allow subsidies up to 20% of firms' cost for adapting to new environmental laws. Agriculture. Environmental programs exempt from cuts in subsidies. GATS Article 14. Policies affecting trade and services for protecting human, animal, or plant life or health are exempt from normal GATS discipline under certain conditions.
The Trade and Environment Committee believes that the basic WTO principles of non discrimination and transparency are not in conflict with the trade measures needed to protect the environment, and also notes that due priority is given to domestic environmental policies through provisions in the WTO agreements. It adds that the system and its rules can help the countries allocate scarce resources efficiently and less wastefully. But having said this, the committee also emphasizes the fact that WTO is not an environmental agency. It is not the WTO's job to set the international rules for environmental protection. It propounds that the most effective way to deal with international environmental problems is through international agreements and conventions. It also points that restrictive trade practices are not the only means through which environment can be protected. Alternatives includes helping countries acquire environmentally friendly technology, giving them financial assistance, providing training, etc.
WTO constituted a Trade and Environment Committee at the end of Uruguay Round in 1994 to enhance its commitment to environmental issues. The committee is entrusted with the responsibility of examining the linkages between trade and environment to the extent such linkages impact trade in goods, services, and intellectual property, and make suitable recommendations about any changes that might be needed in the trade agreements. It notes that due priority is given to domestic environmental policies through provisions in the WTO agreements. It propounds that the most effective way to deal with international environmental problems is through international agreements and conventions, helping countries acquire environmentally friendly technology, giving them financial assistance, providing training, etc.
Since its inception, the WTO has remained at the forefront of efforts to promote globalization. Globalization is the result of free or less restricted trading in goods, services, technology, and capital among countries. The experience so far has been encouraging, but an often heard accusation is that the WTO system treats trade as the priority at the cost of environmental and humanitarian objectives. Sustainable development of protection and preservation of environment might be enshrined as fundamental objectives in the agreement establishing WTO, but many argue that the WTO does little to actually promote environmental protection. A vast array of environmental conservation and public policy NGOs and organizations such as Greenpeace, Friends of the Earth, One World, etc., contend that WTO undermines health, safety, and environmental standards. Since its inception, the WTO has remained at the forefront of efforts to promote globalization. Globalization is the result of free or less restricted trading in goods, services, technology, and capital among countries. The experience so far has been encouraging, but an often heard accusation is that the WTO system treats trade as the priority at the cost of environmental and humanitarian objectives. Sustainable development of protection and preservation of environment might be enshrined as fundamental objectives in the agreement establishing WTO, but many argue that the WTO does little to actually promote environmental protection. A vast array of environmental conservation and public policy NGOs and organizations such as Greenpeace, Friends of the Earth, One World, etc., contend that WTO undermines health, safety, and environmental standards.
WTO is often accused of treating trade as the priority at the cost of environmental and humanitarian objectives. Many argue that the WTO does little to actually promote environmental protection. A vast array of environmental, conservation, and public policy NGOs and organizations contend that WTO undermines health, safety, and environmental standards.
Another complaint about WTO provisions is that they do not allow trade to be restricted on grounds of production and processing methods. This issue was brought to the fore by the infamous tuna dolphin case, whereby Mexico challenged the US restrictions on imports of tuna in cases where fishing methods did not minimize the incidental kill of dolphin. The WTO ruled in Mexico's favor, stating that restrictions could be based on product attributes but not process methods. The general point was that GATT rules did not allow one country to take trade action for the purpose of attempting to enforce its own domestic laws in another country, even to protect animal health or exhaustible natural resources. The term used here is extraterritoriality. The environmental case is that if one method of processing, such as a method of fishing out tuna, causes environmental damage, that is high level of incidental killing of dolphin, then an importer should be able to express preferences for the product, in this case tuna, to be processed in a way that does not cause environmental damage, that is caught using fishing methods that reduce the incidental kill of dolphin. The general case for making a provision in the WTO for the right to restrict trade on these grounds is that to do so assumes the WTO should include provisions to secure public policy objectives other than trade. Another case of WTO environmental dispute is the shrimp turtle case. In 1998, the US closed its market to shrimp caught without turtle exclusion devices to support the US Endangered Species Act. India, Malaysia, Pakistan, and Thailand brought a joint complaint to the WTO. The US lost the case on account of violation of WTO rules, not under Article 20 for seeking protection of environment, but because it discriminated between WTO members. The WTO pointed that it provided countries in the Western Hemisphere, mainly in the Caribbean, technical and financial assistance and longer transition periods for their fishermen to start using turtle excluder devices. It did not give the same advantages, however, to the four Asian countries, namely India, Malaysia, Pakistan, and Thailand, that filed the complaint with the WTO. In a sense, legal reasoning acknowledged that in some circumstances, country could use trade measures to protect global resources. Nevertheless, US still maintains statute but restricts imports by shipment, not by country.
There have been many complaints about the WTO provisions since its inception. WTO provisions are accused of not allowing trade to be restricted on grounds of production and processing methods. This issue was brought to the fore by the infamous tuna dolphin case, whereby WTO stated that restrictions could be based on product attributes but not on process methods. This was in contradiction with the environmental case, which states that if one method of processing causes environmental damage, then an importer should be able to express preference for the product to be processed in a way that does not cause environmental damage. Another case of WTO environment dispute is the shrimp turtle case. The WTO pointed that it provided countries in the Western Hemisphere, mainly in the Caribbean, technical and financial assistance and longer transition periods for their fishermen to start using turtle excluder devices. It did not give the same advantage, however, to the four Asian countries, that is, India, Malaysia, Pakistan, and Thailand, that filed a complaint with the WTO.
The more fundamental problem is the lack of adequate support among WTO members to make the organization and its rules more environmentally sensitive. The developed countries render support, though partial, but the greatest opposition comes from the developing nations, who fear that rich countries will use environmental concerns and related issues to erect barriers to the products of the developing world. Such fears are rooted in the deeper frustration with the distribution of benefits from the WTO agreements, which are regarded as biased towards developed nations. This makes it highly difficult to lead the WTO environment relationship out of its current impasse. What can be understood is that environmental impacts are a concomitant of free trade. So, whether further liberalization occurs will depend on the importance the popular opinion attaches to the issues such as environmental policies, human rights, labor standards, and national sovereignty. It will also depend on the ability of advocates of free trade to articulate in a clear and compelling manner the argument that in the long run, free trade is the best way of promoting adequate protection of environment.
The supporters of free trade and WTO propound that WTO agreements try to make trade support the things we really want, including a clean and safe environment, but at the same time prevent governments from using these objectives as an excuse for introducing protectionist measures. Its members are encouraged to protect natural resources, endangered species, and the environment, but there cannot be any discrimination. The supporters also argue that it is the rich countries that pass strict environmental standards, not the poor ones. In their view, free trade, by raising living standards in developing nations, will encourage passage of such laws in these nations. Supporters argue that the stance of representatives from developing nations, which account for a majority in the WTO membership, also weakens the position taken by environmentalists. They believe that greening the WTO rules would mean old protectionism in a new environmental disguise, such that the effect would be to trap the developing nations in the vicious cycle of debt and poverty. What must be kept in mind is even though WTO rulings become automatically authoritative, unless consensually objected to by all its members, no country can actually be forced to remove the restriction that was found incompatible with WTO rules. The purpose of the WTO is to enable countries to gain benefits of an open trading system. If it is to be given the task of realizing other international public policy objectives, such as protecting the environment, its capacity to meet its core function, that is, raising prosperity through trade, will be undermined. In the words of George Soros, the task of the WTO is to lay down ground rules for international trade. It is not designed to pursue other social goals. So the trouble is thus not really with the WTO, but with the lack of similarly powerful and effective institutions devoted to these other social goals. Thus, a case to alter the WTO to permit trade restrictions on environment grounds is not a solution to the environmental problems.
The United Nations Conference on Environment and Development, that is UNCED, in 1994 laid down some principles on trade and environment. They stated that the preferred international approach to protecting the environment was to create multilateral environmental agreements, that is MEAs, in which members would agree to adopt commonly agreed principles in their national laws or practice. They also stated that use of trade measures to protect the environment should be avoided. The WTO's committee too favors this approach and adds that it complements their work in seeking internationally agreed solutions for trade problems. In other words, using the provisions of an international environmental agreement is better than one country trying on its own to change other countries' environmental policies. Applying this approach in the tuna dolphin issue, all countries fishing in the region would enter in an international agreement requiring their fishing fleets to use the same fishing methods as they would do in a regional fishing agreement. This would be better than one country impending a trade sanction to make another country comply with its preferred environmental, that is fishing policy, as was the US position. But the opponents of the sanction approach would argue that were it not for the caution, the regional agreement would not have been adopted. This may be so, but it calls for justification of the globally denounced option of applying caution because it disregards the sovereignty of the nations simply on the grounds that the more normal approach of seeking an international agreement is too slow. In the case of effect on dolphins in the eastern tropical Pacific region, there was no case for urgency. The species concerned were not endangered.
To tackle the environment degradation problem, more normal means of achieving international agreement to meet international public policy objectives are needed. Keeping this in mind, United Nations Conference on Environment and Development in 1994 created multilateral environmental agreements in which all members would agree to adopt community agreed measures in their national law or practice. They also stated that use of trade measures to avoid the environment should be avoided. In other words, using the provisions of an international environmental agreement is better than one country trying on its own to change other countries' environmental policies. Let us now summarize what we have learnt in this module. The WTO is the only international organization dealing with the global rules of trade between nations. The WTO agreements cover goods, services, and intellectual property. The WTO has no specific agreements dealing with the environment. However, there are several provisions in the WTO agreements catering to environmental concerns. The most important provisions, as far as the environmental issues are concerned, are Article 20 of the GATT and the SPS and TBT. Many argue that the WTO does little to actually promote environmental protection. The critics of WTO highlight the systemic bias in its rules against the rights of states to enact and enforce environmental standards, citing the rulings in the tuna dolphin case and the shrimp turtle. The WTO supporters argue that it encourages protection of the environment and health, but at the same time prevents governments from using these objectives as an excuse for introducing protectionist measures. The United Nations Conference on Environment and Development recommends creation of multilateral environmental agreements as the preferred international approach to protecting the environment. The WTO's committee also favors this approach.